Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Please note that this event will be recorded. You, the audience, will not be visible and all of the mics will be turned off. Please note, though, that after the talk, we will be leaving time for questions, and we're asking that you write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will be helping our guest speaker keep track of the questions and select which ones she will answer. If you would like to ask the question yourself rather than have me read it out, please write "Ask Live" in parentheses at the end of the question when you submit it using the Q&A button. Okay, and now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our inaugural speaker, Dr. Ersula J. Orr. Dr. Orr is the Lincoln Professor of Ethics in the School of Social Transformation and Associate Professor of African and African American Studies here at Arizona State University. She is a critical race rhetorician who researches and teaches in the areas of African and African American studies, rhetorical studies, and women and policing. Her research explores the suasive strategies of Black Americans as they operate within a post-emancipation historical context, and gives particular attention to the ways physical and discursive violence influences performance of citizenship. Dr. Orr's book, Lynching, Violence, Rhetoric, and American Identity, which examines lynching as a rhetorical strategy and material practice interwoven with the formation of America's national identity, received the 2020 Book Award for the Rhetoric Society of America. Dr. Orr's current research investigates the ways civility discourse masks misogynoir and how such masking reinscribes civility as the racist articulation of a past that expresses the desire for a particular kind of, quote, ordered present and future. Dr. Orr's work can be found in a variety of peer-reviewed academic journals, as well as the book Rhetorics of Whiteness, Post-Racial Hauntings in Popular Culture, Social Media, and Education, which won the 2018 Conference on College Composition and Communication Outstanding Book Award in the Edited Collection category. She is also a 2018-2019 Outstanding Mentor Awardee. Her talk today is titled Anti-Blackness, Lynching, and Breath as Liberatory Praxis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Orr. You're still muted, Ersula, sorry.
Thanks, classic Dr. O. Dr. G, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to speak with you today and to be included in the effort to reconceptualize graduate curriculum and to serve in the as the inaugural speaker for Sheskis, a new colloquium toward a libertary theory and praxis. I realize that you all can see the participants. Let me close that. So a little bit about me. I'm a first generation graduate and postgraduate scholar from the Mid-Atlantic region, and I'm a rhetorician by training, which means that I study how communication and persuasion works. Another way of saying this is to say that I study how people use symbols, and when I say symbols, I mean specifically how they use language and other forms of communication, such as art and performance and writing and even silence. Yeah, silence is rhetorical, to produce desired ends and outcomes, to get things done in the world, to produce desired effects. During this lecture, I invite you to consider the ways anti-blackness specifically reflects the hypocrisy of American democracy and how critical democratic literacy assists African Americans in navigating the ways America is set up to kill them. Pessimistic? Yes. We'll talk a little bit more about that point later on. In this brief lecture, I will discuss the logic and rhetoric of anti-blackness and what I call a critical democratic literacy. When I speak of critical democratic literacy, I'm referring to a method of reading and interpretation specific to the experience of being Black in America that reflects an attunement to ethical evaluations of the past and living engagement with the past. Critical democratic literacy is an interpretive lens that identifies what America's ways mean for Black lives and Black futures through attention to how the past reverberates in the present. This attunement reflects a different orientation to time, one that A, calls attention to the unfinished business of emancipation, and B, identifies demands to get over it, the it in this case being get over slavery or get over race or get over the whole past, because like we're over that because we're post-racial, which means like we're over that past that has no effect or function or power or presence in the present. Those types of refrains, a critical democratic literacy identifies those kind of refrains as the exclusive privilege of those with white racial standing. Through attention to the rhetoric and practice of lynching, I will demonstrate how Black folks in America have employed a critical democratic literacy to draw attention to the unfinished project of Black emancipation and as a mode of navigating the suffocating anti-Blackness of American democracy. I'll begin first by providing some definitional and theoretical framing, and then I'll offer a brief example of what a critical democratic literacy looks like. Before thirdly, identifying in connection to Afro-pessimism and closing with some brief words on breath and breathing as liberatory praxis. Because when we talk about Afro-pessimism or a pessimistic stance, the question is always, wow, that's incredibly nihilistic, where do we go from here? So let's end with, where could we and where do we and where have we gone from here? Okay. So, anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is a specific form of racism targeting Blacks that informs how people with power make decisions. It challenges the implied assumptions that all ethnic and racial minorities have the same lived experience. Anti-Blackness is the perception and or belief that Blacks are inferior and not fully human. It is prejudices and beliefs and stereotypes about Blacks that have dire consequences for them in all sectors of civil society, including housing, labor, the economy, healthcare, education. For example, this year we watched the structural and institutional racism weaponize the respiratory disease that structurally rendered the most essential worker, a demographic dominated by Black and non-Black women of color in particular, because it is these individuals that saturate positions of sanitation, transportation, healthcare industry, and food services. The most disposable, as essential workers were denied the basic PPE needed to protect themselves as they cared for the sick. This August, the CDC reported that COVID deaths among Blacks was disproportionately higher than any other group on account of how accumulated and intersecting inequalities facing Blacks, inequities facing Blacks in all sectors of civic life, labor, housing, education, health, and the justice system impact individual and community health. Anti-Blackness is a global systematic conditioning that takes many iterations, such as misogynoir, which is anti-Blackness specifically targeting Black women. An example, consider how beliefs around Black people's tolerance for pain and supposed proclivity to lie impact Black medical patients every day, Black childbearing mothers every day. Consider how stereotypes around the sexuality of Black women makes Black sex workers particularly prone to sexual assaults by law enforcement officers. Consider how claims of inexperience wielded at political candidates from Shirley Chisholm to Barack Obama to Stacey Abrams code anti-Black sentiment as legitimate concern over a candidate's competency for office. We're not going to talk about competency today, but I had to put a pin in that one, boy, because if anybody paid attention to those debates last night, I feel like we need a moment of silence. I feel like we need a moment of silence. So here's a poll for everyone. Serena Williams, for those of us who know who she is or might be remotely familiar with who she is, recently had a child, recently became a mother. If I'm not mistaken, I think her daughter is 2 years old, maybe 3 years old. Someone check in with me and let me know correctly and help me get my numbers right. But for the poll for today, Serena Williams' childbirth nightmare is an example of A, racism, B, anti-Blackness, or C, misogynoir. Again, given what we just learned about anti-blackness and variations of anti-blackness, how would you categorize Serena Williams' childbirth nightmare? As racism, as anti-blackness, or as misogynoir? And just to recount, anti-blackness is a global systematic conditioning that takes many iterations, such as misogynoir, which is anti-blackness specifically targeting Black women. Give folks a few more moments. Great. So 67%, 68% say misogynoir, 27% say anti-blackness, and 5% say racism. Okay, thank you. So, next definition, critical democratic literacy. So as I mentioned earlier, a critical democratic literacy is an interpretive lens derived from over 400 years of experiential knowledge and Black collective memory. Black collective memory constitutes an archive of lived experience and Black expressive culture that indexes what democracy has meant in the way of freedom and liberty for Blacks, which is not freedom and which is not liberty, but in actuality has been a consistent, insistent conditions of enslavement, containment, possession. As such, critical democratic literacy serves as a method of reading and interpretation specific to the experience of being Black in America that reflects an attunement, as I said earlier, to the ethical evaluations of past and living engagement with the past. So if literacy denotes competence or knowledge in a given area, then a critical democratic literacy denotes knowledge of civil society's dependence upon anti-Black violence. That is, forms of social death. I'm sorry, can you all see that? Oh, you can all see that. Forms of social death constituted by reoccurring forms of enslavement, capture, and containment. Slavery, Jim Crow, the prison system, mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, and pathways of confinement for young girls are just a few examples of how social death mechanizes democracy's racial capitalism. A critical democratic literacy understands that justice evades Black life because Black suffering has historically been profitable. A critical democratic literacy denotes knowledge that as a constitutive outside of America's us, Blacks stand as the enemy within against which we, the people, not Black people, must defend. Note the pessimism in this understanding and this interpretive frame, right? Finally, a critical democratic literacy acknowledges that anti-Blackness is embedded in US infrastructures and sustained in everyday and institutional rhetorics. As such, it denotes the ways that Blackness in America signals the status of always already dead. Think quickly here about Breonna Taylor. You can't kill what's already dead. Hence, officers can't be held for murdering or recklessly endangering Breonna's life, but can be indicted for endangering the lives of the white family next door. As you may recall, none of the officers were charged for killing Breonna. However, one officer was indicted on account that several of his bullets endangered the lives of Breonna's white neighbors, who are currently in a settlement process over the total disregard for the value of human life, this is quoted, right, from their suit, shown them by officers on the night they shot and killed their neighbor, Breonna Taylor. An indictment that erases Breonna as the chief victim of racist policing is an indictment through which we can observe the ways that laws render white authority, officer discretion, and qualified immunity synonymous. A critical democratic literacy permits a different reading of justice, one that resources Black collective memory to identify the ways Black suffering, Black victimization, and Black containment mark the constitutive outside of American identity. This is the founding argument of my Lynching, Violence, Rhetoric, and American Identity. In doing so, this critical lens identifies the continuity between past and present iterations of anti-Black violence as the stuff, as the body of US citizenship. That is, as the corporal material that gives American identity its shape, its substance, and its color. In my book, Lynching, Violence, Rhetoric, and American Identity, I demonstrate how critical democratic literacy, A, informs readings of contemporary anti-Black violence, and B, how this interpretive framework reflects a countertemporal orientation towards white or national time, which assert an end as opposed to a continuance of colonial and racial violence. As I argue, it's this literacy practice that permits Black folks to read Trayvon Martin and Emmett Till as the same thing, despite the 50+ years between them and the difference of form in their murders. Black folks read Trayvon Martin and Emmett Till as the same thing because they read the continuity in the motives of their deaths. Yet when Oprah Winfrey vocalized his perspective during a 2013 interview, she was wrongly accused of race baiting and criticized for being hyperbolic, divisive, and ironically enough, anachronistic. But like the rest of her community, Oprah, a woman of the 1950s, read the same lines of reasoning, the same lies, the same false logic, and the same circumvention of justice as in the case of Emmett Till. Much of the resistance to her read stemmed from the shame and silence around the history of lynching in America. By the late 1950s, lynching had been discursively marked as dead through discourse that narrowed its definition to deny its existence. The narrowing was intended to rescue the nation from further being stigmatized by anti-lynching rhetoric that collapsed lynching and whiteness with national identity. While Oprah's analogy may seem sensible to us now, the debate that ensued in 2013 evidenced just how deeply Trayvon's murder and the persistence of lynching specifically troubled the myth of America's post-racial society. The 21st century was supposed to be a mark of an America over race, not an America still mired by the backwardness of racist thinking. As then President Obama explained, Trayvon's surveillance, his stalking, his murder, acquittal of his murderer echoed a very difficult history in America's past. The very difficult history that Obama avoided detailing is America's history of lynching, the sadistic practice of ritualized anti-Black violence that included acts of surveillance, mutilation, murder, and display, and operated under the open participation of law enforcement and the participation of the judicial system and legislative branch. I hope this is beginning to echo and ring a bell for some folks, that this sounds acutely familiar, like we are experiencing a time of supposed past in our immediate present. Lynching stripped Blacks of the right to due process of law by imbuing the fine people and respectable men and women of the mob with the authority of judge, jury, and executioner. So in 1900, when Ida B. Wells defined lynching as America's national crime, she was in part arguing that lynching was proof that democracy wasn't about maintaining equality among we, the people, but instead about maintaining equality among the only people who counted, that is, white people. Government indifference to the plight of Black citizens and the failure to pass anti-lynching legislation further corroborated Wells's contention that lynching was a manifestation of the racial contract. In Lynching, Violence, Rhetoric, and American Identity, I trace the rhetoric and practice of lynching from the colonial era to the contemporary moment to demonstrate the centrality of lynching to the making and the maintenance of the nation and its people. This mapping reveals how, despite the ways the discourse and practice of lynching have changed, each remain driven and thus connected by the same past motive, which is to ensure racial capitalism in America. In short, lynching as a disciplinary technology exhibits an ideological belief regarding Black inferiority, white superiority, and the need to keep Blacks in their racially prescribed place. Oprah's public statement, as well as Obama's statement that Trayvon could have been his son or even himself 30 years ago, exemplifies how critical democratic literacy reflects a living engagement with the past. The murder of Ahmaud Arbery Sally offers a more recent example of how the trope of lynching is used to make sense of what makes little. While 2013 exhibited anxieties over reading Black police brutality as part of an American tradition of lynching, we see a sharp shift in this reluctance following Eric Garner's murder, 2014 death and dying last words of "I can't breathe." Garner's lynching demonstrates how a difference in form, the chokehold in this case, does little to mass motive, policing Blackness, which remains to discipline Black bodies so that they remain in their racially prescribed place. We can observe how this critical democratic literacy has gained greater traction and acceptance since Trayvon's murder. This summer, we watched, heard, and or read about how Ahmaud Arbery ran for his life, fought 2 men for his life, and lost his life in broad daylight because he was believed to not belong where he was. The refrain, "jogging while Black," which encapsulates the anxiety of Black mobility, reflects experiential knowledge regarding the precarity of being Black in America. As a literate practice, it and others like it highlight how justice systematically evades Black folks and that it echoes the inevitability of Black death at the hands of the state. It was this literate practice, once specific and isolated to the Black community, that has now, through the isolation and devastation of a suffocating upper respiratory disease, become adopted as part of America's national consciousness. As I've said elsewhere, regarding these headlines, to read Ahmaud Arbery's murder as a lynching is to read the arch of history. Americans know this the same way they know that justice doesn't come in the form of a hunting party. Therefore, they rightly read Ahmaud's murderers, Travis and Gregory Michael, as lynchers. Lynchers adopted the culture and rhetoric of the hunt to normalize and depoliticize the eradication of Black life as an everyday practice. Americans observed rightly how the Michael's rhetoric of the hunt meshed with the rhetoric of neighborhood watch to frame their murder as an innocent Black man as vulnerable citizenly action. Earlier, I mentioned that a critical democratic literacy reflected a different orientation to time, one that denoted the cyclical nature of racial oppression, the centrality of anti-Black violence to the making and maintenance of the nation and its people, and the modern existence of Black folks as the unfinished emancipation of the enslaved. Adhering to an Afro-pessimistic understanding, which takes anti-Blackness to be an ideology that frames Blacks as perpetual enemies of civil society, isn't the embrace of a hopelessness or a nihilism, but a step towards understanding how breath, the act of breathing, can be a fugitive and liberatory practice in consistent instances of social death. In closing, I'd like to share some words from Imani Perry. In her book, Breath, she reminds that finding breath in the hold of the wake is challenging but not impossible. Breath in times of suffocating anti-Blackness requires that we learn not only to breathe, but also to chat with death, to find through the engagement with the past and those who have passed insight on how to move forward because only by breathing life back into the past can we become a living accord and record a way forward in the present and in the future. Perry's breath and the instructions therein take on added importance in the context of a pandemic that compromises the respiratory system and kills by suffocation. COVID-19 has exposed in rather overt terms the various inequalities and forms of structural oppression that haunt Black life. As reports from the CDC and research teams nationwide have revealed, African Americans are dying at disproportionately higher rates of COVID-19, in some cities as much as 4 times the rate of whites. Currently, the lives of over 20,000 African Americans have been claimed by the disease, and more are promised to follow as inequalities in labor, housing, health, and the economy, such as the concentration of Blacks in medically underserved areas, the increased number of Blacks in essential industries such as sanitation, healthcare, and transportation, overcrowding in homes, prisons, and detention centers, and a healthy and reasonable mistrust of healthcare systems due to a history of medical apartheid, structurally render those who are simultaneously the most essential and the most vulnerable, the most disposable. Whether a noose, gunfire, a knee, or a disease weaponized by structural forces, America's campaign of anti-Black terrorism continues. Breathing in times of suffocating anti-Blackness demands recognition that the degree of difference between Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and the 20,000 Black victims of COVID-19 is marginal. It is a difference of form, not motive. Only in a country built on Black disposability can jogging while Black be considered criminal or suspicious. Do officers mercilessly need necks for the camera? Would they deem the most vulnerable essential but not essential enough to protect? Perry's breath is instructive, informing us that what the dead speak after death are directions and guidance for navigating breath in times of ceaseless and imminent violence. Quote, living defined by terror, Perry reminds, is itself destructive of the spirit. It is submission. The truth is that life is unsafe, and genius more often than not remains unvalidated or even worse, dormant. But joy, even in slivers, shows up everywhere. So take it and keep on taking it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Orr. If you want to take a couple seconds to collect yourself, please, I want to ask our audience to send in their questions so that we may start engaging